This webinar, entitled Israeli-Arab Vote, is a joint project of the Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues and JCPA. Over 4 election cycles in Israel in less than 2 years, the role of Arab Israeli voters, their concerns, electoral power, and internal diversity attained unprecedented recognition. Now, parties across the political spectrum are adding Arab Israeli candidates to their lists and reaching out to Arab Israeli voters. Is this a watershed moment in Israel's domestic Jewish-Arab relations? What tangible changes in representation or policies might it yield? We'll explore the answers to these questions and others, but before we begin, I do want to say a few words about JCPA. JCPA is the network hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local JCRCs and 16 national organizations. And we come together to grapple with pressing issues of the day. If you find today's webinar informative, we hope that you will join us for future JCPA webinars and will consider making a donation to JCPA in support of programming like this. For more information, please visit jewishpublicaffairs.org. Also, please join us for our first virtual annual conference, April 25th and 26th. Visit jcpa2021.org for more information. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar on the upcoming Israeli elections, Liron Shoham, Executive Director at Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues. Liron oversees task force strategy and operations, including member engagement, education, outreach, and communications. Thank you. Liron?
Thank you so much, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here to partner with the JCPA on this event, and a real honor to introduce our speakers, Aluf, Benn, and Makbulla Nassar, and moderate this discussion about the Arab vote in Israel's upcoming March 23rd election. The Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues is an educational organization providing resources and learning opportunities about Arab citizens and Jewish-Arab relations in Israel to American Jewish communities. We're very fortunate to have today with us Aluf Benn, editor-in-chief of Haaretz newspaper, and Makbulla Nassar, Arabic talk show radio host on Radio Ashams, Mandel Fellow for Social Leadership, journalist, political, and feminist activist. I'm also joined by 2 task force colleagues to support audience engagement over Q&A and the chat. It's Ilan Amit and Erica Shaps. They will help answer some audience questions in writing as we go, since we will not be able to get to all of them live, as well as provide clarifications and context over chat. Ilan will also jump in as needed with English translation when my Hebrew has hit its limits. So for logistics, what this means is for audience questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. For comments, clarifications, and side conversations, please use the chat function. Now, if politics around 4 elections in less than 2 years isn't complicated enough on its own, today we're bringing in the element of Jewish-Arab relations within the country, which are layered and complex in their own right. So before we dive in to unpack these and ask our speakers, I want to give a little bit of background about Arab citizens of Israel and the major trends in recent years that inform and influence the political realities unfolding today. I'm going to share 3 slides that take us from basic facts to the current political context, and that will take us to the first question to our speakers. So bear with me one second. Share and all right, hopefully everyone sees this. And hopefully I will not have any technical problems. Arab citizens of Israel make up roughly 1/3 of Israel's population, by far Israel's largest non-Jewish minority. Due to the young age of the population, they make up about 16% of the electorate. I just want to make sure everybody's seeing the slide show. Yes. Arab citizens are diverse in their own right, comprised of Muslim, Christian, and Druze, about 83–84% Muslim, 9% Christian, 7% Druze. And though the population tends to be more traditional, Arab citizens can be traditional, modern, religious, and secular. But as Makbulla will share with us later, all Arab citizens share a complex national identity, which encompasses both Israeli citizenship and immersion on one hand, and strong ties to Palestinian family, history, and culture and issues on the other. Regardless of political ideology, therefore, most political streams in Israel, most Arab political streams in Israel have historically and still are deeply informed by the connection to broader Palestinian issues. That said, over the last 30 years or so, there's been a gradual process of Arab citizens' own circumstances, concerns, and pursuits within the country coming into their own as a distinct identity, both and political pursuits. Much of this is driven by economic status and the wide gaps in the challenges facing Arab communities in Israel. Arab citizens are by far the most disadvantaged of Israel's populations. In 2018, so this is before COVID, 44% of Arab families lived in poverty, which is about 3 times the poverty rate of the Jewish majority. This is correlated with high rates of unemployment and underemployment, with towns and villages that are among Israel's most under-resourced, and with many barriers to accessing Israel's advanced economic opportunities. The need and urgency of addressing these gaps has become a mainstream concern both within Arab society, among younger generations and families who want to see a prosperous future, as well as for the government of Israel, recognizing that a sizable minority that is less integrated is costly for the society as a whole. So over the last 10 or 15 years, increasingly large and complex government economic development efforts have been launched to identify and remove barriers to Arab economic integration, from efforts to enhance access to higher education, to the advanced job market, and beyond. Some of you on this call may have heard of Government Resolution 922. This is the most comprehensive and well-known of these plans. It's a 5-year, 15 billion shekel plan that was launched in 2015 to address barriers to economic integration across the pipeline of economic opportunity. It is one of several such large plans that have been launched to deal with gaps and barriers in different regions and access points. Some of the recent outcomes of these plans mean that today there are far more Arab citizens in Israel's higher education, colleges and universities. 16.2% of undergrads in 2018 are Arab, compared with 10.2% in 2010. And women make up about 2/3 of all Arab students. But there have also been significant increases in women's employment rates, which reached 38.2% prior to the coronavirus crisis, nearly double that of what it was in 2003. In Israel's advanced industries, there are also significant improvements. There are some 8,000 Arab professionals in high tech now, up from only 400 in 2008. All of this contributes to the growth of to the growing middle class, just still small but growing. And on the one hand, what this means is that there is a growing level of leadership and professionalism in Arab society, whose impact is being felt in the private sector, in local government, in civil society, and more. It also means that there's fundamentally a more vibrant vision and aspirations for real access to opportunities, prosperity, and meaningful integration in Arab society. That said, gaps remain wide, and many of the gains that have been made aren't necessarily being felt on the community level. So towns are still under-resourced, infrastructure is a problem, access to commercial zones is still limited. So it means that the sense of satisfaction, the sense of possibility is not evenly distributed, not by region or by population, and contributes to, and depending on how people feel access to this opportunity, contributes to frustration, mistrust that change is actually taking place. So it is no coincidence that in parallel with these socioeconomic developments, in which you have strong leadership and opportunity for some and still frustrations on others, there's also a growing political involvement, leadership, and pursuit of meaningful and influential seat at the table. This finally brings us to the subject of today's call, which is the Arab vote and participation in Israeli politics. I'll start with the joint list. One of the most significant developments in Israel-Jewish-Arab relations in recent years, political relations, was the formation of the Joint List Alliance of ideologically diverse Arab-led political parties, formed in 2015 as a practical response to the raising of the electoral threshold, meaning the number of votes that are needed in order to just gain any seats, in order to just enter the Knesset. The small Arab-led parties before probably would not have been able to pass the threshold on their own, and the joint list was formed as a safety net to ensure representation. Together, in 2015, they earned 13 seats and became the third largest party in the Knesset. But they came to represent more than just the desire for representation at all and a practical safety net. They came to represent something much deeper, which is the fundamental drive of Arab citizens for meaningful influence in the national political and governing arena, regardless of internal ideological differences. Fast forward to today, back-to-back elections in Israel really pushed this drive for participation to a peak. Last year at this time, the joint list rallied historic Arab voter turnout around this vision for influence. That by virtue of size, they could be the key partner to the main opposition parties and unseat the incumbent prime minister. The right-wing campaigns countered with intense campaigning against the legitimacy of cooperating with the joint list, which is also thought to have drawn out Arab voters against this negative campaigning. And ultimately, Benny Gantz, the leader of the opposition, declined joint list support. Fast forward to today's elections, a whole new discourse is born. Prime Minister Netanyahu is campaigning in Arab cities, has initiated cooperation with Ram. If you look at the slide, Ram is the part of the joint list which represents the Southern Islamic movement, and they have split from the joint list alliance over this issue of cooperation with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Arab society is debating which political approach can give cooperation or not cooperation, can give relief to the burning issues in Arab society like violent crime and the economic impact of the coronavirus, which has hit the weakest element levels of the population hardest. So on this note, Aluf Benn, editor of Haaretz, I want to stop the share. Here we go. Please, what happened? How did we have such dramatic changes in discourse about Jewish-Arab political cooperation in so short a time? This is both a question, also an invitation to give us a bit of an overview and get us started.
The lowest ebb of this was in July 2018, which was the last hurrah of the last functioning four-year government in Israel, was the passing of the nation-state basic law, which says that Israel is the nation-state only of the Jewish people and of no other people, and which was seen, it could not be interpreted in another way but to say that Arab citizens are second-class citizens, and now it's the law of the land. And this was a major celebration of all the right-wing parties that supported, drafted the bill, and passed it through the Knesset. And shortly after that, the government collapsed for other reasons, and since then we've been in an endless election cycle, in which, growingly over time, Arab voters became the focus of the campaign. It began with the joint list splitting and then regrouping, and winning unprecedented achievement of 15 seats in the Knesset, making it once again, the third largest party in the Knesset. And for the first time, the leaders of the center left, of what we call the no Bibi camp, realized that without the support of the Arab voters through their representatives, there will be no ousting of Netanyahu, and he will remain in power. And I remember Ayman Odeh, the leader of the joint list, speaking at an Haaretz conference in Haifa shortly before the September 19 election, and saying that if they would have 15 seats, Netanyahu would not be prime minister. Well, it wasn't exactly correct, but when I asked him about it last week, he said, you're right, Netanyahu is the prime minister, but he was weakened and restrained, and the only way that forced him to change and to share power with Gantz and so on was the joint list becoming so big. And then came Gantz, the leader of the No Bibi camp, and for the first time ever met the leaders of the joint list, member of Knesset Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, and had their photo taken together, which has not happened with any leader of a Jewish Zionist party since 1948 to this time and ever since. So was the, all the leaders of the left wing that are praising themselves for being so supportive and cooperative with the Arab members of Knesset never agreed to have their picture taken together. But this was not enough for Gantz, because when Gantz and his camp twice faced the opportunity of forming a cabinet with the support, even a tacit support, I mean, not becoming officially part of the coalition, but voting for this coalition of the joint list, they stepped back. It was Lieberman in September 19, and then Gantz, when also facing defections from his camp in April of last year. And that was the end of it. And Netanyahu, and then came the most unexpected development in this campaign, in which Netanyahu, rather than just speaking out against the joint list, played a role in splitting it, in pulling Ram, the Southern Islamic movement, to the right-wing camp in a way, and then started campaigning in Arab towns and villages like never before, like no other Jewish politician has ever done. I think the last thing was Sarah Netanyahu going shopping in Shafama, which yesterday, and Netanyahu going to Bedouin tents, and Netanyahu speaking up in Nazareth. And interestingly, the other right-wing parties, the far-right parties, Lieberman, Nassar, and Benn, the more ideological right-wing parties, have not criticized Netanyahu for doing that. And clearly the same Netanyahu who won the election 6 years ago by warning against the Arab voters coming in droves to the polling stations, and we must save, and you voters must save the right-wing rule, and now apologized, and following suit were Yair Lapid, the main leader of the center-left in Israel, who also campaigns in Arab towns, and he promises to change. Lapid voted against the nation-state law, but now he also promises to fix it and to add provisions of equality into the law if he's elected. And the list goes on and on, which means that for the first time, we see that the idea behind the joint list, that the Arab voters should come to vote, should make a difference within the system, is working, at least in terms of representation, in terms of visibility, in terms of attracting the Jewish politicians to campaign there. Now, taking any politician's promises, let alone Netanyahu's, should always be taken with a ton of salt. And this is clearly the case today. But in terms of visibility, this is unprecedented. And clearly, this is the key element in this election is the turnout of our voters, and what was seen as science fiction only a few months ago. Would there be significant votes for Likud or for the pro or the quasi pro Likud Ram in the Arab street on March 23rd? Can the joint list survive its split and the disappointment of many of its voters by its failure to gain part of the government? Would it regroup? Would it find different issues to fight for? And last but not least, as part of that, social issues within Arab society, especially crime and lack of law enforcement, especially the number of homicides that remain unresolved in Arab society, became a national issue. So for the first time that I can recall, as journalist, as citizen, internal issues within the Israeli Arab society are becoming national issues and national social issues for everybody. And again, we don't see these murder cases resolved, but at least people are noticing that some effort should be done in that direction, rather than saying, this is a minority group that we don't want to deal with.
Thank you. I think that lays out a beginning, and there's so many questions. You know, are Arab? Does it look like Arab citizens will vote for Netanyahu? Is there a chance that he will get mandates? How is the Arab street reacting to all this visibility? I want to go to Makbulla and give you the opportunity to respond to Aluf, but also ask you. You know, Makbulla, first of all, by your own description, you were born to political awareness and have been a lifelong political and feminist activist. And you, as a talk show host, you also have your finger on the pulse of Arab political discourse in Israel. In your response, if you want to respond to what Aluf just raised about the reactions to Netanyahu campaigning, if you can also take us and begin by sharing with us the significance of the joint list for Arab citizens and what it means for it to be weaker at this moment. What makes the split this time different from the other times the list struggled with internal differences? Thank you. And unmute yourself.
Good. Okay, thank you, Liron. Thank you all for having me. Actually, lately, Netanyahu he looks like he's campaigning only in the Arab society. Today he was in Abu Ghosh, yesterday in the Naqab, and also the whole family is campaigning in the Arab society. That's really fascinating in this election. And he's visiting the weakest, maybe, or the most places that is actually suffering gaps and problems and discrimination. So I really wish that he's already there, that he would also support his campaign with some more programs that would really solve the problems of Abu Ghosh, Jisr al-Zarqa, and the Naqab. This is just because I had to say something about this, as this has been like the hottest thing in the news in the last 2 days. But I want to go back a little bit about the joint list. It was one of the most like shifting events happening in the Palestinian or Arab politics inside Israel in 2015. We had a lot of hopes around the joint list. This came from two places. One, that it's right, the Arab society is so eager to have more participation and influence in the political Israeli system, in the Knesset. On the other side is a lot of frustration because of the continuous gaps or social and financial and economic problems happening in the Arab society. And you know what? Also, the joint list has even much more function as a symbolic. Only together they will be able to take a very bold decisions, such as going or to recommend on guns. No separate Arab party has done this before, and Gantz he's also a general. He used to be the chief of staff of the IDF, the Israeli IDF. So it makes it much more harder for the Arab society to accept that, and a lot of criticism actually was directed against them because of this recommendation. And you know what? This is part of the process. We are here because of this background that the Arab support or recommendation was not wanted. Gantz actually by turning down the getaway plan that the joint list gave him to Netanyahu after he was campaigning that he's the one who's going to beat Netanyahu, and he got the tool and he didn't do it. And you saw, and it's really funny and amazing now that Netanyahu is now actually chasing these same votes. This says a lot about Gantz, but this experience left the Arab voters so unconfident, so much less confident in the Arab leadership and also in the Israeli democracy. The meaning was, it doesn't matter if you actually go with your influence and you're maximizing your power democratically inside the system, inside or together like others in Israel, it doesn't mean anything. 15 mandates, it's a huge thing in the Israeli Knesset, but we didn't really have this kind of influence. So yeah, there have been some kind of a disappointment, and this is really prepared for what's happening here. A lot in the Arab society also claimed that when the joint list recommended on guns, that this is a slippery slope, that other things will come. And actually what's happening now, that Abbas is saying the same things. Okay, we already recommended the center, the right wing, it doesn't matter. Why won't we work with Netanyahu now? As he's using also this term, I will use him and he will use me.
So I just want to jump in and make sure everyone is clear. Mansour Abbas is the leader of RAM. That's the the Islamic movement party that has split off from Joint List and is cooperating with Netanyahu. And as you're saying, really is promoting this pragmatic approach, saying, you know, if Netanyahu is going to use us for his own political interests, let's use him to get gains for Arab society. And this is creating conflict within Arab political discourse.
So, in fact, we know that the conflict that is happening now, or the key question in the Arab society that's happening now around the Knesset election, is about cooperating or not cooperating with Netanyahu. But this is not all. There is another parallel, a big argument and discussion happening. I hope it's discussion, even getting to more clashes sometimes between demonstrators and so this parallel process happening. It's mainly social and mainly about who are we? Are we religious? Are we Muslim? Are we conservative? And this actually was resulted by the voting that was in the Knesset about the LGBT rights and the prevention of the conversion treatment.
So I'll do 10 seconds on that. There was a bill this year about banning conversion therapy for LGBTQ, which was very challenging for the Joint List because Ayman Odeh, who was the chair of the Joint List that was promoting a progressive agenda, was compelled to vote in favor of banning conversion therapy. But LGBTQ issues are a very different status in Arab society, which has not been opened or processed as much culturally as, say, in the mainstream Jewish society. So a few other from the Joint List abstained, a few voted for, and this has been this has proven to be a very, very big argument within Arab society.
In fact, this argument and this kind of a clash in ideology, what would we do believe in social issues, and so was happened accidentally. But now in the election, the Islamic movement, Mansour Abbas, he came to conclusion that he has to use actually to use more this conflict in order to gain, in order to have more voters, and he is succeeding. And in fact, these kind of issues have been reached in the last week. There have been two violent incidents happening. One against Abbas himself in Al-Fahim. He were attacked by political activists, mainly about his approach towards Netanyahu. But the second day, there was some kind of a revenge act from other activists from the other side against Aida Sliman in Jaffa, and she were accused with many difficult things, which most of them are not true. So we could see
Aida Sliman is second on the Hadash list. She's a woman MK. She's Hadash is the Jewish Arab Communist Party that is leading the progressive agenda.
Yeah. So this is the parallel discussion happening in the Arab society. And if you want the truth, these two issues, like cooperate or not to cooperate with the system, left wing, right wing, doesn't matter. And the other question, what are we are we conservative family values and these issues? And we are also Christians, Muslims, and Muslims. So where do we stand from these issues? This was supposed to be the 4 things that the Joint List had to agree upon since they were established, but they didn't do that. And this is one of the reasons that they are splitting now, because they actually did not have a cohesive structure between each other in order to deal with these issues. Besides that, and we know that they have a lot of leadership problems. They do not accept each other's leadership, and this is one of the reasons that we are in this situation now. But only I just want to add something about how does the Arab society really react to Netanyahu's approach or trying to be nice to the Arab society. I would say that there's a division also towards that. In Nazareth, he was accepted with a big demonstration, actually, and a violent confrontation between the police and demonstrators happened during this. While in Rahat, he was received with coffee and sweets, and so you could see there is many. The Arab society is not actually in one place in this time, and this is really very, very strange, because usually we used to be much more cohesive, at least toward one thing, the right wing and Netanyahu, and now it's not.
Very, very interesting. I want to direct, I want to ask Aluf to reflect on the dynamics in Jewish society then. Netanyahu is reaching out to Arab cities, it's unprecedented, to Arab voters, it's unprecedented. Some of the other right-wing parties are maybe a little bit hesitant, but they're not, I think as Makbulla said, they're not fighting him on it. And meantime, now Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid is saying that he would cooperate in speaking with the joint list.
Which he opposed several years back. He was very vehemently against it, and for the first time, he's saying nice things about the joint list.
So there's the leadership readiness and perhaps political interest of partnering, and then there's the public. Do you see a change in Jewish public readiness for political cooperation, Jewish Arab political cooperation in Israel?
Well, I think that in the center left, from the center to the left, I think it's a realization that there is no future. When the left is in shambles regardless, but there is no future for that camp without cooperation with the Arab voters. And as much as the right wing, the Netanyahu camp, has no future without cooperation with the ultra-Orthodox voters. But there's one more thing that we must, that we overlooked, and that is that throughout this past year, there was a lot of protest against Netanyahu. Mostly around his residence in Balfour Street in Jerusalem, to a lesser extent near his Caesarea residence, and then, in the streets and highways, bridges, etc. By and large, Arab citizens were not there. Presumably, they were afraid of police violence that would probably be more directed against them than against Jewish protesters. Based on experience, but they were missing. In other words, you can see differences between both parts of the anti-Netanyahu bloc. But at the same time, I think that the Jewish society is more mature in understanding that, and again, the COVID situation also contributed to that. And more than anything, the less visibility of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the number of incidents around Gaza or in the West Bank or let alone within Israel per se, within the Green Line, is I think the lowest ever, or if not ever, then it's the past 20 years for sure. It's almost gone from the public discourse. And in the COVID situation, we're all in this together. So at the beginning, I would say the mainstream acceptance of the Arab society was through the very large, high visibility of Arabic speakers in the medical stuff, in hospitals, in the COVID departments in hospitals, etc. And then people realized that if we want everybody to be vaccinated, then you need to care about the minorities, that we're all in this together. And I think this was a major contribution to the understanding the social issues in Al-Fahim and Taibe. In the end, are social issues in Tel Aviv and Holon and Ramat Gan as well, that you cannot just ignore such a large part of society. Now, I'm not saying that it's happy ever after situation. It's a long way to go. Discrimination exists. It's not going to wither away anytime soon. The gaps among students are huge, and are only becoming worse because of the COVID situation, where children are not allowed, we're not allowed to go to schools. There's an ocean of work to do there. But I think that people realize that there are many Israelis who speak a different language, who have a different national identity. And in this respect, the Netanyahu visits to the Arab towns are I don't want to say a game changer, but it's significant, because I think that the followers to Netanyahu, whoever they might be, would not want to ignore that part of society as much as the predecessors did. You know, Leah Rabin never went shopping in Nazareth or in Shoham or in any Arab town.
So I have several stacked follow-up questions. So I'm going to start with Makbulla. Do you want to respond how you see COVID having influenced Jewish-Arab relations? And then let's add to that, because there's some questions coming in as well about this, the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements with the UAE. And I'm sure Aluf, you'll have something to say about that too. So start with that, and then I'll keep stacking.
Definitely, the COVID-19 crisis also helped Netanyahu have more reach to the Arab society. It's not only to the Arab society, the whole weak population who had difficulties in this time. They were, how do you say, everybody were waiting on what Netanyahu would declare as a package of support for the public. So it's very important for the Arabs, because, as you said, almost 50% of the Arab families are under the poverty line. So he used this. He used also the vaccine the same way he's doing it. So in this, we are in the same boat also, Aluf, Arabs and Jews, in this kind of something happening about COVID-19 and the burning issues that's happening, including also the exploding of the crime issue in the last year. It is exploding. It's 2 decades it's exploding, but in the last 2 years it was so huge in the Arab society. So these two factors actually help preparing for this kind of discourse, with whether Netanyahu can be a partner or not for the Arab society. And as I said, like, we know that the model it's trying to be in the field now. It's the model of Mansour Abbas, the Islamic movement, that he wants from the one hand to cooperate with Netanyahu, and the other hand to keep, as he says, the values of Islam. I don't know how he's going to combine that, but this is really very, very important. And another thing about the Abraham agreements, peace agreements, I think it's really, it does have some kind of influence on Netanyahu's way of approaching the Arab society. I don't think he would like to be caught on the stage or recorded saying very racist things about the Arab society, and his new friends and partners in the Arab Emirates will hear that. So maybe, and I have to indicate that previously, when Netanyahu used to have this kind of very negative statement against the Arab society, especially the statement he made in the election. The danger of that, the risk of that, he and Lieberman, they actually were mainstreaming, no matter if they actually implemented any of these threats or things they said, but they made this kind of speech so in the mainstream, and this led to a wave of many racist attacks and discrimination happened to Arab society by other Israelis. So so if Netanyahu stopped doing that, no matter from what for what interest he needs that, but that's good. That's good. Because we need the leader not to give a backup atmosphere for racism. And if this is happening now, I'm feeling that.
Thank you. Aluf, responses to the influence of the Abraham Accords on
Abraham
current discourse.
Accords, look, again, as I said, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in a low ebb. So it was the Abraham Accords have yet to be, well, hopefully not, but the test of any peace agreement between Israel and any Arab state is when things explode on the Palestinian front. You know, during the Second Intifada, all those Gulf and Maghreb countries who had made peace with Israel after Oslo shut down their diplomatic offices in Israel and severed formal ties. And now it took 20 years to get it back. So it's not easy. The importance of the Abraham Accords is that for the first time, Israel has made peace with an Arab state that has much higher GDP per capita than Israel's. And for the first time, the reaching out in cooperation, about a week after its signing, we got an offer from Gulf News, from a website, with a news site within the Emirates, to hold a conference together and to exchange some content. This had never happened with any newspaper in Jordan or in Egypt. 70,000 Israelis, when it was still open, you know, within days, 6 flights a day from Tel Aviv to Dubai. This was unexpected. A friend of mine, a business person who had his office in London, moved it to Dubai. This was unthinkable only a year ago. So this gives Israelis a different way of seeing the Arab world than ever before. Would that be so precious for Israel not to risk it in return for what? Netanyahu was able to trade his idea of annexation of parts of the West Bank in return for the Abraham Accords. His challengers from the right, Nassar and Bennett, are not saying that that if they're elected, they're going to annex. They're afraid of Biden and the Biden policy in the Middle East. So clearly, and then by the way, the joint list voted against the Abraham Accords because of their disregard for Palestinian rights and for Palestinian goals. And I have no idea how the Arab society, you know, behind the politician saw it. But clearly, it's a game changer in the way of Israeli integration into the Middle East. More than peace with Egypt and even peace with Jordan have done.
I would say that only the Arab society were so ambivalent, split. Yeah, they know it's the Palestinian issue that was neglected in this time, but they wanted the opportunity to go and to have this relation with the Arab Emirates.
And thank you. And I wanted to ask, so segue this into a question about the ambivalence in Arab society and the changing leadership that we see, because right now you have so many options on the table for Arab voters in a way that there hasn't been for a long time, that we are getting questions about what is their actual support for Abbas in Arab society? Does it look like he'll get the mandates? And if so, does it look like he will back Netanyahu, as he's saying? There's also new Arab candidates now in Meretz and Labor, not from the joint list, and a different profile. What is the response to them? And what is the voter excitement right now for voting at all and for continuing to back the joint list? How did this affect voter turnout? Not just the disappointment over Gantz before, but now the campaigning that is happening.
Is it a question for me?
Yes, for you, and of course, Aluf as well.
First, you know, most of the polls does not actually indicate that the Islamic movement will pass the threshold, but I think they are wrong because the Islamic movement is now actually approaching a lot of sectors in the Arab society that did not vote enough in the last election, like the unrecognized villages in the Naqab. And I think they are doing a lot of job. And this population is not really, surveys and polls do not really can manage to get to them. And I would admit also, because in my radio program and also the discussion around, yeah, people have this kind of, if they are arguing about this, it means that there is a place of this kind of discussion happening. My evaluation, yeah, they will pass the threshold. And another point about, like, there's another competition for the joint list, not only Ram and the Islamic movement who split from, there's a competition also. There's another party have been actually running now, it's called Man. Other Arab candidates, also very strong Arab candidates, went to Jewish parties like Meretz and the Labour. I'm talking about the filmmaker Ibtissam Marani in the Labour Party. A lot of fuss happened around her also, and Ghaida Rinawi Zobi in Meretz. And they actually, and we could see there is a change in the type of people actually running now on a Jewish Zionist parties in Israel. In the past days, to be just a vote buyers. I'm sorry to say that, but today we are talking about very serious people who want to have influence and want to integrate in these kind of parties. And a lot of the Arab society see this as a negative thing, but I would tell you that the bright side of this thing, that there is a lot of very good capacities for leadership in Arab society, that especially women, and they don't have any place in the joint list or in this limited construction of leadership that is being like stabilized with these four parties in the Arab society. This is also very significant process happening, that competition also inside the Arab society and inside the Jewish parties. And this idea about, you talked a lot about Nassar and Bennett and others, they are not attacking Netanyahu for approaching the Arab. I would like to talk about like Lapid and others. It's really a pity. It's really sad that those who are not Netanyahu or anti-Netanyahu were waiting to Netanyahu to give them the permit or the green light to work with the Arab society. So yeah, and this level, there's another change happening.
So right now we have a situation where we're seeing a changing list of candidates, changing discourse, and also promises being made. Netanyahu is promising action on crime. He's promising budgets. He's giving inclusive language. Yet there's a big unknown if this will result in more Arab representation in the Knesset or less in this next government. And if there's less, there may be significantly less incentive to make good on these promises. What can we expect to be some of the lasting impact of the unprecedented discourse and some of these promises and the relationships being built? And then what's at stake if Arab citizens drop off the agenda? Aluf?
Well, first of all, we don't know, because some of the parties involved are playing with the threshold. One is Meretz, that is on the verge of its extinction, and the other is the Mansour Abbas, the Ram party. So the number of our members of Knesset might be smaller. Regarding budgets, look, after the election, again, we don't know if there is going to be a functioning government or a fifth election, which is not highly likely, at least very likely.
Wow.
So we don't know, but at some point the bills for the COVID relief funding would have to be repaid, which means higher taxes, smaller government programs. The fight for the existing budgets would be fierce, and I'm not sure whether the Arab society would be able to get its fair share, or even something approaching that fair share. So it might all evaporate after the election, many of these promises. But I think that the visibility and the legitimacy of the discourse is changing, and I think it's going to be very difficult to take it back with one footnote here, which is a big footnote. Another explosion in either of the Palestinian fronts in Gaza or the West Bank might take a lot of it backwards. And we saw it 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago during the last war in Gaza. That was a devastation to the Palestinian society within Israel. And it took several years to reduce that tension. And then again, this is always the cloud that is above everything. It's the big elephant in the room, or whatever cliche you want to use to describe it. As long as it's quiet outside, then it could be more cooperative and friendly inside. And we can talk about LGBTQ issues and about crime and lack of punishment and about social budgets and about education.
It's quite dramatic how much.
Once it's explosive outside, then tension rebuilds very quickly inside. And I'm afraid that we're still on shaky ground here. That I can say, no, that's now we're going to live happily ever after. And clearly, any effort to resolve or to mitigate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going, and even the Abraham Accords from the outside, or whatever initiative the Biden administration might take vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine, this is going to have a positive effect on relationship within Israel. Any backwards move to the wrong side, to the violent side, is going to have bad reflection on relationship, inter-societal relationship within Israel.
Makbulla, I want to let you answer, but I also people are asking about the impact of Biden on the two-state solution and therefore on inter-Arab relations. A few more words about that before I hand it off to Makbulla.
Well, look, as much as we can tell, the people in the Biden administration are the same people who negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran several years back, and some of them were also involved in Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, even going back to the Clinton administration, people like Rob Malley. Mm-hmm. So far, we have not seen any strong initiative by the Biden administration to deal with this. They have more pressing issues on their agenda, both COVID and economic relief within the United States, U.S.-China, Cold War, and regionally, the Iran deal and their effort to bring it back to the table. And so far, they've not, they're going to keep the Abraham Accords going. So I don't see any imminent action on the Palestinian issue, very different from what Obama did. Obama, from the first day he took office, he had made it into a very serious foreign policy issue, and he said that it was a national security interest of the United States to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is not the issue today, but clearly a Biden administration and a Biden's control of this, with the Biden control of Congress, it's a very different scenario for an Israeli right-wing government, and the next Israeli government would be a right-wing government. Even if it's not Netanyahu, we're not going to see the Rabin or Barak government again. And it's going to be far more tense under the watchful eye of the Biden administration to make statements about, and which disappeared from the campaign as well. You don't see the right-wing Israeli politicians talk about annexation, or as they call it, sovereignty over the West Bank, because of the Biden administration, and not because they suddenly, read some left-wing literature and became right-wing turncoats and support the two-state solution.
Thank you. Makbulla, over to you. Now there's a lot to respond to. So I'll backtrack and say, the question was, right now there's a lot of promises being made to Arab society, crime bill, economic development, and yet we're also in an economic downturn following coronavirus. If a lot of this depends and a lot of this rests on how much voter turnout there will actually be. If there's less representation in the Knesset than there is now, there's also significantly less incentive to make good on these promises. So the question is like this: what might be the lasting effect of this discourse on Arab politics, on Jewish-Arab political relations? What tangibly might come out of it? What's at stake if Arab citizens drop off the agenda? And then just a small piece, let's add the question about the Biden administration to you.
Okay, I just want to remind you all that these promises that have been made in these elections are not advantages or privileges that the Arab society will enjoy after the election. We are talking about the crime rates, we are talking about housing, we are talking about unemployment, the consequences of the COVID-19 issue. So we are not talking about like the Arab society is trying to have like a luxury or a bigger slides from the budget that we are not actually we don't deserve it or something like that. So these promises are still, these promises actually are filling the gaps of the past, the decades of low budgeting and discrimination to the Arab society. So I had to put this on the table. Netanyahu is bargaining with our rights. He's not giving anything new to the Arabs. And we have to remember that also Netanyahu's approach to the Arab society has another side. He has a continuing trial going on now. So these votes, any vote, 1 or 2 or 3, is being changed from this side to this side through the Arabs for Netanyahu is very crucial and very essential. It's not only that he couldn't have his comfortable, dreamy coalition in the last election because of the Arabs. So this investment he's doing now is actually there. And I would say it's a test, and we will wait. Mansour Abbas, the Islamic movement, want to test a new approach in the Israeli politics, and it won't take long, as Aluf said, till something happens in Gaza or in the West Bank, and we will be back to square one. So, and if after, you know what, I have to say that this thing also here, if Netanyahu also this time plays the Arab party that split from the joint list, and he does with the Islamic movement the same way he done with Gantz, with previously with all of the Israeli politicians, that he actually moved them from their ideologies to his, and they lost everything. If this happening again, it have a lot of disappointment. I think a lot of consequences on the Arab-Jewish relation inside Israel. So we need to know what would be happening as a result of this test. And the last thing I would say that it has this period. I cannot see this election as separate from what happened before and what would happen after. And I'm not that worried, because we know this election actually made a lot of wounds in the Arab society. But I'm not worried about that, because we need to reach we need to open these big problems, these discussions, in order to get to the Amika Shaveh, or to the right way later. I will stop here, and because it's 8 here.
It's 8. It's 1 o'clock, and I want to thank you, Aluf. If you have 10 seconds, 15 seconds of a last word, of a closing word.
Well, just to say thank you for organizing this and inviting us, and you know, now we have 2 weeks to wait and see how the election unfolds.
Yes, two very tense weeks full of questions. We opened up so many interesting subjects. We hope that we'll be able to come back after the elections and be much wiser and hopefully very optimistic, because we need it. Thank you both, Aluf Benn, Makbulla, Nassar. It has been a pleasure speaking with you. We can go on much longer. And thank you to the JCPA, Randy, Melanie. This call is officially closed. Thank you.